The worst mistake a person can make is believing a piece of paper is more powerful than the truth written underneath it. I still remember the sound before I saw the damage. It was 6:12 in the morning when the low rumble of a diesel engine rolled across my property, shaking the quiet that had protected my family's land for almost 50 years. I stepped onto the back porch, coffee still warm in my hand, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Fresh diesel fumes mixed with old cedar wood and the cold morning air. Then I saw it. A bright orange construction vehicle sitting beside my grandfather's barn. My barn. The same barn where I learned how to repair an old tractor, where my father taught me how to measure twice and cut once, where 3 generations of walkers had left their fingerprints on every wooden beam. But that morning, a crew from Cedar Ridge Estates was standing behind a temporary fence with a sign that made my stomach drop. Community Property Improvement Area. I walked across the gravel, feeling every stone press through my boots, and asked the foreman the only question that mattered. Why are you on my land? He looked uncomfortable, like he already knew the answer wasn't going to sound right. He pulled out a clipboard and pointed toward the paperwork. We were told this area belongs to the HOA. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Not a misunderstanding. Not a simple paperwork mistake. Someone had decided they could rewrite the history of my family's property with a signature and a stamp. Then Victoria Caldwell stepped out of her white SUV. The president of Cedar Ridge Estates HOA. She wore a perfectly pressed jacket, carried a folder under her arm, and had the calm confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already over. Ethan, she said, smiling politely. I understand this is surprising, but the barn is located within the Community Expansion Zone. Community Expansion Zone. That was a phrase I had never heard in any conversation about my property. My property. The 18 acres my grandfather bought in 1976. The land where I spent summers running through tall grass, where I learned the value of hard work, where my family built something without needing anyone's permission. Victoria opened her folder and showed me a map. It had colored lines, official-looking markings, and a neat little HOA logo in the corner. She tapped the paper like it was the final word. According to our records, this structure falls under association control. I looked at the barn behind her. The old wooden doors were faded from decades of Texas sun. The hinges still carried the same rust patterns I remembered from childhood. And above the entrance was a small metal plate my grandfather installed in 1978 with our family name engraved into it. Walker Farm. I wanted to argue. I wanted to raise my voice. But my grandfather always told me something different. When someone is wrong, don't beat them with anger. Beat them with proof. So I took a breath, looked at Victoria's map, and asked one simple question. Are you absolutely sure that survey is accurate? Her smile never disappeared. But for just a second, her eyes changed. Because she knew something I didn't know yet. And she had no idea that the official survey she was ignoring was about to reveal a truth that would change everything. The morning after the construction crew left my property, I walked out to the barn before sunrise, and for the first time in my life, that old building felt like it was standing in the middle of a battlefield. Not because of what was happening around it, but because of what it represented. To anyone passing by, it was just an old wooden structure sitting on 18 acres of Texas land. Weathered boards, a faded roof, a pair of heavy doors that creaked whenever the wind pushed against them. But to me, it was a living piece of my family's history. My name is Ethan Walker, and I grew up knowing that land the way some people know their own hometown streets. My grandfather, Thomas Walker, bought those acres in 1976 when the area was still mostly open fields and farmland. Back then, there were no perfectly trimmed neighborhoods, no stone entrance signs, no HOA meetings discussing what people could and could not do with their own property. There was just hard work, open skies, and families building something that would last. My grandfather was not a wealthy man. He worked with his hands, fixed his own equipment, and believed that anything worth having was worth maintaining. That barn was his workshop, his storage space, and his place to teach my father everything he knew. Some of my earliest memories were inside those walls. I could still remember the smell of fresh-cut lumber when my grandfather repaired the west side after a storm. I remembered the sound of tools hitting the workbench and the way sunlight came through the small gaps between the wooden boards in the late afternoon. When I became a civil engineer, I realized something important. My grandfather understood construction before he ever studied a blueprint. He understood that every structure had a foundation, and every foundation needed proof that it belonged where it stood. That lesson stayed with me. Years later, after my grandfather passed away, I inherited the property and decided to restore the barn instead of replacing it. I could have torn it down and built something modern. A bigger garage, a newer building, something that looked impressive from the road. But that was never the point. The barn was not valuable because of the wood or the square footage. It was valuable because every corner carried a memory. That was why Victoria Caldwell's claim bothered me so much. She did not see a family legacy. She saw an opportunity. Cedar Ridge Estates had grown around my property over the years. Houses appeared where fields used to be. Roads expanded. New residents moved in. And eventually the HOA started acting like every piece of land nearby existed for their convenience. At first, I ignored the small things. A letter asking me to repaint the barn doors. A notice saying the property needed to better match neighborhood standards. I handled every request calmly because I believed reasonable people could solve reasonable problems. But Victoria was not interested in finding common ground. She was interested in control. The strange thing was, I never felt worried about losing the barn. I knew my family owned that land. What worried me was how easily people accepted her version of the story without checking the facts. She had a polished folder. She had official-looking documents. She had a room full of homeowners who trusted her confidence. But confidence does not create ownership. Paperwork does not change history. And somewhere inside the county records, I knew there had to be something that proved the truth. I just had to find it before Victoria turned her claim into something everyone believed. Victoria Caldwell did not raise her voice when she came back to my property 2 days later. That was the thing about her. She never needed to shout. She had mastered the kind of calm confidence that made people question themselves before they ever questioned her. She stepped out of her white SUV carrying the same leather folder from our first conversation, walked across my gravel driveway, and looked toward the barn like she was inspecting something she already owned. The morning air was cool, and the smell of fresh coffee from my kitchen still lingered behind me, but all I could focus on was the sound of her boots pressing against the gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Every step felt like a reminder that someone had decided my property was no longer mine. "Ethan," she said, stopping a few feet away, "I hope you understand that this is not personal." I almost smiled when I heard that. In my experience, whenever someone says something is not personal, it usually means they have already made it personal. She opened her folder and pulled out several pages. Cedar Ridge Estates has been growing for years. The community has invested millions of dollars into maintaining property values, and structures like this one create concerns. Structures like this one. She could not even say the word barn. To her, it was not a place where my grandfather spent decades working. It was an item on a checklist. A problem to remove. "You keep saying community property," I told her, "but you have not shown me a deed. You have not shown me a transfer document. You have shown me an HOA map." Her expression barely changed, but I noticed her fingers tightened slightly around the folder. "The association records are clear." That sentence bothered me more than anything else. Not because it was convincing, because it was designed to sound convincing. Victoria understood something important about people. Most people hear words like records, association, compliance, and official, and they assume those words automatically mean truth. But after years working with construction documents and property plans, I knew better. A document can be wrong. A map can be outdated. A signature can be meaningless if the foundation underneath it is broken. That afternoon, I received my first formal notice from Cedar Ridge Estates. The envelope was thick, the paper was expensive, and the language was carefully written to make a simple disagreement sound like a legal emergency. It claimed my barn violated neighborhood standards. It demanded I stop all maintenance work. It included daily penalties if I refused to cooperate. I stood in my kitchen reading those pages while the old ceiling fan turned slowly above me. The sound was almost hypnotic. A quiet reminder that the world was moving forward while someone was trying to erase a part of my past. I called my sister Megan that evening. She had helped organize our grandfather's estate paperwork after he passed, and she knew every document we had. "Ethan," she said after listening carefully, "something does not feel right about this." I agreed. Because the more I looked at Victoria's claim, the more I noticed what was missing. No original survey. No signed property transfer. No record showing my grandfather ever gave up ownership. Just a newer map created after Cedar Ridge Estates expanded around us. The next week, Victoria held a neighborhood meeting. She stood in front of dozens of homeowners and described my barn as an obstacle to progress. She talked about property values, community appearance, and future improvements. She made it sound like she was protecting everyone. But I noticed one detail. She never once mentioned the actual boundary lines. She never talked about the legal description of the land. She never discussed the original records. Because she knew the same thing I knew. The truth was not on her map. It was buried somewhere else. And I was going to find it. The first thing I heard that Monday morning was not the sound of my own alarm. It was the sharp crackle of paper sliding through my front door. When I picked it up, I already knew who it came from. The Cedar Ridge Estates logo was printed across the top in bold green letters. The same logo Victoria Caldwell used every time she wanted people to feel like the neighborhood belonged to her. I stood there in my kitchen, the sunlight coming through the windows, the smell of fresh coffee filling the room, and I opened the letter. What I read made one thing clear. Victoria was no longer asking me to cooperate. She was moving forward with her plan. The notice stated that I was in violation of community standards and that my barn would need to be addressed immediately. It included a list of fees, restrictions, and deadlines that made it sound like my family's property had suddenly become a problem that needed to be corrected. I placed the paper on the counter and stared at it for a long time. My grandfather's old pocket watch sat beside it. He carried that watch every day he worked on the farm. The metal was scratched, the glass was slightly cloudy, but it still worked perfectly. It reminded me of something he always said. People can argue about opinions. They cannot argue with facts. So I stopped arguing with Victoria's opinions. I started looking for facts. I spent the next several days going through every document my family had collected over the years. Tax records, maintenance receipts, old photographs, property statements, anything that could tell the real story of the land. The problem was that Victoria had prepared for this. She had built a story around her version of events, and she had convinced many people to believe it. At the next HOA meeting, I sat in the back of the room and watched her present her case. The clubhouse smelled like fresh paint and expensive cleaning products. Homeowners sat in rows, listening carefully as Victoria stood beside a large display board showing the neighborhood map. "We are not taking anything from anyone," she said with a calm smile. "We are simply correcting a misunderstanding that affects the entire community." Correcting a misunderstanding. That phrase stayed with me, because from where I was sitting, it looked like she was trying to correct history. Then she showed a picture of my barn and called it an outdated structure that no longer served a purpose. I looked around the room and saw people nodding. Some believed her. Some were just afraid to challenge her. That was when I realized the biggest problem was not the paperwork. It was perception. Victoria did not need everyone to know the truth. She only needed enough people to accept her version before the truth had a chance to catch up. After the meeting, my neighbor Sam Reynolds walked over to me. He was 70 years old, had lived nearby longer than Cedar Ridge Estates had existed, and had watched the entire area transform from farmland into a planned community. He looked toward the barn through the clubhouse window and quietly said, "Your grandfather would not have liked what they are trying to do." I asked him if he knew anything about the property lines from years ago. He paused for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "I remember there was a survey crew out there before those houses were ever built." I looked at him carefully. "A survey?" He nodded. "Your grandfather kept records of everything. He never trusted anyone who only used words when paperwork mattered." That night, I walked back into the barn with a flashlight in my hand. The wooden beams cast long shadows across the floor. Dust floated through the light, and the quiet felt different than before. I was no longer just protecting a memory. I was searching for the evidence my grandfather knew might one day be needed. Somewhere, hidden among old files and forgotten records, there was an answer. And I had a feeling Victoria Caldwell was counting on me never finding it. The next morning, I drove to the county records office before the sun was fully up. The parking lot was almost empty, and the only sounds were the hum of the air conditioning units and the distant noise of traffic starting another workday. I carried a folder with every document I had collected so far. Tax records, family photographs, old repair receipts, everything that proved my connection to the land. But I knew memories were not enough. Stories were not enough. I needed something Victoria Caldwell could not dismiss. I needed official records. Inside the records office, the smell of old paper and dust filled the air. Rows of cabinets stretched along the walls, holding decades of property histories. A clerk named Daniel Brooks helped me search through the files. He was patient, professional, and careful with every document he pulled from storage. Property lines can get complicated when neighborhoods expand, he explained. A lot of people assume the newest map is always the correct one. That is not how ownership works. Those words stayed with me. The newest map. That was exactly what Victoria was using. A map created after Cedar Ridge Estates grew around my family's land. For hours, Daniel and I searched through records from different years. Then, buried between two older property documents, we found something unexpected. A survey reference from 1976. My grandfather's original purchase year. My hand stopped moving for a moment when I saw the date. There it was. A record that existed before Cedar Ridge Estates was even planned. But when Daniel opened the file, his expression changed slightly. "This is interesting," he said. The document referenced a detailed boundary survey, but the actual survey map was missing from the county file. Missing. That word bothered me. Not lost. Not destroyed. Missing. Someone had separated the most important piece of information from the rest of the record. I asked Daniel if that happened often. He shook his head. Not usually with something this important. That afternoon, I returned home and looked at the barn differently. For the first time in days, I felt like I was getting closer to the truth. But Victoria was not waiting quietly. When I arrived, I found another notice attached to my front gate. This one was more aggressive than the first. The HOA had scheduled a formal review of my property and warned that further action could be taken if I refused to cooperate. I stood there holding the paper while the wind moved through the grass around me. The same land my grandfather walked. The same ground where he built something with his own hands. And now someone who had never met him was claiming authority over it. That evening, I called Megan and told her what we found. She went through old family boxes again, searching through documents we had not reviewed before. A few hours later, my phone rang. Her voice sounded different. Not worried. Focused. "Ethan," she said, "I found something." I sat up straight. "What did you find?" There was a pause. Then she answered. A photograph of Grandpa standing beside a survey marker near the barn. And there is a date written on the back. I looked toward the window. Outside, the barn stood quietly under the evening sky. After everything Victoria had done, after every notice and every accusation, we finally had a direction. The proof had been there all along. We just had to uncover it before she finished rewriting the story. The morning of the official survey, I woke up before my alarm. I had barely slept. Not because I was worried about losing the property, but because I knew the next few hours would finally reveal whether facts still mattered in a fight against confidence and influence. Outside, the Texas sky was still painted with the soft colors of early morning. The air was cool, the grass was covered with a thin layer of moisture, and the only sounds were birds in the trees and the quiet hum of my truck engine as I pulled away from the house. Daniel Brooks arrived at 8 a.m. with his surveying equipment and a folder of documents. He was not the kind of person who made dramatic speeches. He simply trusted measurements, records, and evidence. That was exactly why I wanted him there. Victoria Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later. Of course she did. She stepped out of her SUV wearing the same calm expression she always carried, like she had already decided how the story would end. 2 HOA board members followed behind her, holding copies of their neighborhood maps. "I hope this does not become unnecessary drama," Victoria said. Daniel looked at her paperwork and calmly replied, "The purpose of a survey is not drama. It is accuracy." That sentence changed the entire mood. The survey equipment was placed near the edge of the property line, and the process began. For the next several hours, there was no arguing. No speeches. No accusations. Just measurements. The small screen on Daniel's equipment displayed numbers while he moved from one point to another. Every few minutes, he checked his notes and compared the location with the historical documents we had found. I stood near the barn watching everything happen. The old wooden structure looked exactly the same as it always had. The faded boards, the weathered doors, the metal plate with my family name above the entrance. But now it felt different. Because this time, the barn was not just a memory. It was evidence. Around noon, Daniel walked back toward us holding his folder. Victoria immediately stepped forward. "Well?" she asked. Daniel looked at the documents one more time before answering. "The barn is not located on HOA property. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced during this entire situation. Victoria's expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "Are you certain?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "The official boundary line places this structure entirely within the Walker property." He then pointed toward another section of the survey. "There is something else you should know." Everyone looked at him. Daniel explained that the original boundary line from 1976 showed something Cedar Ridge Estates had overlooked. The HOA had been using part of the land near the access road based on their newer development map, but that area was also within my family's original property boundary. For years, they had been building their assumptions on a map that was never the final authority. Victoria looked down at the papers in her hands. The same documents she had used to challenge me suddenly seemed much smaller. The confidence she carried into my property that morning was gone. She did not say much after that. She simply asked for a copy of the survey and left. I watched her SUV disappear down the road, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. But I also knew this was not over. Finding the truth was only the first step. Now I had to make sure the truth was recognized by everyone who had believed. Victoria's version of the story.